Hello, folks. Oh, cool. We got new music. We are back. Welcome back to season 2 of Inclusive Collective. I am Nadia Butt, joined with my co-host Rob Hadley.
Hey, Nadia.
How you doing? We're back.
We're back. We're back. This is it.
This is
I've been
it.
waiting.
The people wanted us back. The people spoke. We did take a little bit of a break. How was your summer?
It was fantastic. Most of the time, I was just been sitting here waiting for you to call to see if we were going to continue to do this, if I was going to get invited back.
You got invited back.
Then
You made the cut, Rob. Made the
so
cut.
yeah. And then I don't know if you saw, but the New York Times declared the skinny jeans were dead.
What?
So I spent a lot of time cleaning out my
Oh,
my closet because I baggy stuff is in, and which is fun too. But
oh, that
I had
is
a great
fun.
summer. We traveled a little bit and definitely tried to get some sense of normalcy. Here we go as we're going into the fall. So
It's
really
true.
happy to be back. Really excited to be with you. How was the end of your summer, Nadia?
The end of my summer was great. Went to Washington, D.C. for about a month, had a couple of friends' weddings, enjoyed the beach and the beautiful weather. And yeah, just transitioning to the fall, pumpkin season, which is one of my favorites.
Love it, love it. I miss
Yeah.
it. They've not figured out how to do that here in Utah to
Oh,
do
really? That's a
the
shame.
apple cider donuts. Yeah,
Oh,
so
man.
big miss. Yeah,
Yeah. So, Rob, I thought it'd be a great opportunity for us to reintroduce ourselves to our listeners. Do you want to go ahead and introduce
I'll go
yourself?
first.
Yeah.
I'll go first. I'm Rob Hadley. I'm a people and culture strategist with expertise in diversity, equity, inclusion, and employee experience, mostly on the analytical side, but I also do a lot of strategy work as well.
Very cool. And I am Nadia Butt. I'm a talent development and belonging strategist and a researcher on inclusion, identity, and intersectionality. So, Rob, we got some new changes going on, right? What's happening?
So many new changes, exciting changes, right? So you heard the new music, love the
Loved
new
it.
music.
It's a little more upbeat,
Also,
right?
little more upbeat. Also, we're going to change the format. If you remember, all the way back to June and July, season one was really a deep dive into one specific industry and all the issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion in startups and venture capital.
Yep.
We are now going to change that up a little bit, where we will be talking about different topics each week. We will dive in and break down different news headlines as they relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll continue to have some of our great guests, and they'll be featured as well. We'll also be releasing the podcast on Mondays, right? So
Yes.
our listeners can start off their week with Inclusive Collective, which is very exciting as well. And I think we have we got a new studio as well that was built for us. No,
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. The studio that we asked for that's invisible and virtual.
yes.
Okay, so let's go to our top news stories. Here's what we're talking about as DEI practitioners. Rob, what's our first story?
Yeah, Nadia, I don't think we can avoid talking about it. Over the last week or so, we lost a queen. I was just curious on your thoughts on the death of Her Majesty as a person of Pakistani descent. And I thought of you when I saw that Pakistan was having a day of national mourning. And so I just thought of you, wanted to get your perspective and wanted to know if you'll be pouring one out for the queen, as they say.
Oh, pouring one out. Um, so thanks for that for asking my feelings. I think I'm just indifferent. Like I enjoy history, I enjoy visiting Great Britain, but I could care less about the monarch and celebrating like the legacy, to be quite frank. And I feel that the queen and the monarchy represent a really dark history that continues to plague present day society, right? Like there were very real things that have made impacts in the world today, like oppression, exploitation of people. And I talk to my colleague and classmate Shella about this all the time. This idea of colorism, like she kind of reminds me that colorism is a byproduct of racism and white supremacy. And growing up, lighter skin signified some level of wealth and some level of
Hmm.
education and being more civilized. And so, like, I know
Right.
people my age that, like, still bleach their skin so that they're whiter, but
Mm.
That's so do you know, am I pouring one out for the queen? No, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. Are you?
I have to acknowledge my own biases here, right? So I come from a place of not caring about monarchy at all or any monarchy. I think that probably my Midwestern sensibilities. I can't get excited. I never could get excited, even when they were alive and popular, and so I would have to say that I'm a little bit surprised at the overwhelmingly positive coverage, right? So that all the things
Mm,
that you just mentioned,
mhm.
I haven't seen a ton of that even in our mainstream media. I sound like Sarah Palin now, right? But you don't
Yeah, I get
you
what you're
you
saying.
you you hear a lot of all these like really it's been overwhelmingly positive. I've seen the most nuance probably on the BBC's coverage in terms of some of the themes that you were exploring.
Sure.
And then when we think about the link to this show, the thing that I was surprised about was seeing heads of corporations writing official notes of sympathy to the British people
Ah,
on the
yeah.
loss of the Queen and the monarchy, and openly mourning the loss of a person that for so many was a symbol of colonialism, oppression, white supremacy. I really felt like that was exclusive and inappropriate
Uh-huh.
for heads of companies to do that. And it takes me even back to like when we talked to DEI leaders and they talked about how when Black Lives Matter or the events of the last couple of years, how hard it was to get CEOs to write really nice missives about
Sentiments,
the
right.
loss of life of a young Black man. When you see something about the Queen from a company, and it seems like it was very personally written by the CEO, and you just kind of hold those two things up in comparison, and to me, it was just a little bit surprising. I don't think it's necessarily appropriate, and I think that the companies really need to think about when they do that, what they're really saying to their customers around the world.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the next story. So, big news also this week, Patagonia. So, here are the deets. Last week, according to NPR's Here and Now, it was announced that Patagonia's CEO and founder, Shunau, is donating his company, which is estimated to be almost $3 billion, to a specially designed trust and a nonprofit organization to ensure all profits, which is about $100 million a year, are used to combat climate change. Rob, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, and I have a hard time with the name. I'm not sure. I had Chouinard as
Chouinard, is
John
that okay?
Chouinard,
Yeah.
but that's what Google told me is the correct pronunciation.
Okay.
So I don't know possibly, but to me, this is the all time example of a brand living out its values and a leader taking action to make sure that that the future of the company was going to be aligned with his values that he had lived for so long. So he said that his only stakeholder was the planet. I was like, that's really, really cool. So it's amazing, right? And I think that I'll 100% favor Patagonia brands. What do you think?
Yeah.
When shopping, I will take that into consideration,
Mhm.
along with other socially responsible outdoor product companies like Cotopaxi as well.
Sure.
So I will pay a premium for something like this, and I think it's really important that just to see how this leader makes sure that their legacy will be continued even past their death. What did you think?
Agree. I think, just as a consumer who isn't and wasn't as socially, in tune with the climate change and is becoming more and more aware, I think, as a consumer, I am absolutely going to think more about spending, maybe a higher premium on some of the goods that Patagonia has, just because I know that it will, go towards a greater cause. So,
I may even work out now,
I may
I
go
may even get
I may
some
even go
workout.
I may go hiking more,
I
yeah.
may Yeah, yeah, I'll wear my Patagonia vest as I sip a glass of scotch, but
Absolutely.
the bad news on this though is that the same move that was used here,
Yeah.
it can be used by others, and I'm worried that it'll be that, we like this move because we like where all the money is going to,
Ah,
but what I think you're gonna start to see is billionaires of all different stripes start, with differing motivations, start to use the same type of method as a tax dodge.
uh-huh.
So even though we love this idea, the U.S. government could use the billions of dollars that the Patagonia is avoiding in paying taxes here as well,
Yeah.
to fund other things like their own climate initiatives at the government level, and then also things that we really care about, like universal pre-K. So I do
Oh,
worry that this is
interesting.
going to be an arms race, and that billionaires of all different types are going to be using this type of setup going forward.
Absolutely. Something to definitely look out for. All right, well, that wraps up our news segment. We will be right back with our guest, Dr. HeatherJean MacNeil. Be right back. Welcome back, folks. We are incredibly lucky to have our guest, Dr. HeatherJean MacNeil, with us today. Dr. MacNeil is an entrepreneur, public speaker, consultant, and a visiting faculty member at Northeastern University School of Business, where she focuses on organizational behavior. She's dedicated to experiential and transformative learning, which I know our L&D folks will totally geek out on. And her research is at the intersection of new industries, identity, and early stage entrepreneurship with a focus on feminist theory and research methods. Dr. MacNeil's research is informed by her own passion in fieldwork in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and her personal commitment to anti-racism and social justice. In June of 2022, her dissertation research on intersectionality and the cannabis industry won the Best Paper Award at the International Lana Research Conference in Dublin, which I personally can't wait to hear more about. She is a mother of three, a foodie, mediator, travel enthusiast, pug and Frenchie lover, and a farmer at heart. Welcome, Dr. HeatherJean MacNeil. We are so excited to have you on Inclusive Collective.
Thank you so much for having me and for that warm welcome.
You have such an extensive background, particularly in entrepreneurship. You were the founder and CEO of an apparel company and spearheaded Babson's Women Innovating Now Lab. How did those entrepreneurial ventures drive you to research new industries, identity, and early stage entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so when I in my mid-20s, I started my first company called Proxy Apparel. It was a socially responsible fashion business that supported women cooperatives. I really lived the startup journey that maybe some of your listeners have lived. I maxed out credit cards, slept on couches, had great mentorship, but also felt, experienced firsthand the feeling of being othered in certain
Mm.
situations, right? So pitching in front of audiences of all white male investors, quite frankly, on multiple occasions, and, feeling like I was in conversations that felt somewhat condescending to me, potentially because of my gender or my age. It was through those experiences that I just became really aware of how the entrepreneurial ecosystem can be very masculine, very white, and some of the biases that exist. And that fueled me to work with the team over at Babson to start the Women Innovating Now Lab to create just an alternative structure and program to serve more diverse founders. And
Mhm.
and this obviously has very much I developed a research interest as well. Just also to not only examine the barriers that I saw in the ecosystem, but to unearth some of the alternative discourse and narratives and ways of entrepreneuring that I think are happening out there that are getting lost in the ethos.
Very cool. And Dr. McNeil, thanks again. So nice to meet you. And thanks for joining us today. So I do want to talk about your research on cannabis. So I'll start there. Just as, and not for any personal interest reasons, of course. The,
Right.
I, so I believe, that you look at the development of the cannabis industry as an example of what happens when a new industry emerges, right? So when there's and what type of systemic advantages accrue to different classes of people, and so just tell us a little bit about that and what you learned there, just or what you were trying to use that industry for in order to gain insight.
So one of the reasons, well, there are a few different reasons why I became interested in cannabis. Actually, around 2015, 2016, there were these national news headlines that were happening. I don't know, maybe some of you were privy to them, that cannabis was going to be the first $1 billion industry dominated by women. So
Mm,
Oh,
that
wow.
really piqued my interest. It was actually one of sort of my interest around that was one of the primary motivators for me to pursue a PhD, because I thought, what would a $1 billion industry dominated by women look like? What would it feel like? How would the practices be
Right.
different? And women were
Do you know
incredibly.
why they sorry to interrupt, but I'm just curious, do you know why they thought that it was gonna be dominated by women?
Yeah, women were taking on very influential roles at that point in terms of writing some of the early cannabis legislation that was out in Washington, then Colorado. There were some high-profile entrepreneurs that whose story was being told by the press. So there was somewhat of a phenomenon of women entering the industry, and some of them were mothers. It was just they were really mixing up and starting to dismantle some of that stigma around cannabis use. Unfortunately, at this point, women and minorities probably represent less than 25% of leadership positions and power within the cannabis industry. So we're seeing some of the dominant norms continue to play out, but they have been incredibly influential. I'm interested in what we now call, we don't call it minority entrepreneurship anymore, but we're framing it
Mhm.
as the new majority, right? So women, people of color, entrepreneurs from the LGBTQIA community are actually dominating growth trends, and there's a big interest amongst the new majority in cannabis. The last thing I'll mention about cannabis that I think is really interesting is that it's one of the fastest growing industries in the U.S. right now, and so I would just was really my interest has been piqued by how are the new majority sort of shaking up how business gets done in cannabis, and also do new industries offer opportunity for disruption? And I would say that I think that that's certainly been true in the industry here.
So you said that there are some good things, positive things happening there in cannabis, but you also said that the new majority is somewhat underrepresented in leadership positions. What's the overall assessment of how has the new majority profited from the new industry, or have others been able to take advantage of that? More traditional players, have they been more prosperous and successful in taking advantage of that new industry?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the verdict is still out, but the industry is taking shape like many industries in terms of, some of the medical marijuana industry came in early and was able to get a strong foothold. I think my study primarily focused on Massachusetts. I think, again, the ownership of women owners and people of color hovers around 15 to 20%. And of course, that continues to change. But there are a lot of success stories that I feel like I really want to elevate, and people are entrepreneuring differently in cannabis. And I'd love for those discourses to be acknowledged. And one of my major findings from my research was in my interviewing and just study of Black and women founders here in Massachusetts. They're
Hmm.
really conceptualizing entrepreneurship as a vehicle for activism, right? So here we have a high growth space. It's a very different relationship to how they approach business. They see it as a important place of culture change, obviously of economic change, and alternative models of entrepreneurship are emerging. Really exciting models. Actually, down the street from where I live here in Jamaica Plain, there's a cannabis store called Seed. I encourage listeners to have a look, and the store itself is actually a social justice museum. So it's minority and women owned, and the owners have really created a experience where when you're in the store, you're able to really learn about the racialized history of cannabis. And understand kind of that deep history that goes along with the plant that I think is just really, really important. Some of your listenership, DEI leaders, people working within organizations, and I just think it's really important for political and social context to be front of mind as we think about what inclusion should look like, inclusive entrepreneurship should look like. So to me, that's just such a great case study.
Dr. MacNeil, can you help me make this real for me? Talking about intersectionality, we're talking about cannabis. Help me out. So I'm a white male, obviously stacks and stacks of privilege, and I often find when I go to these dispensaries, or if I see these dispensaries, they're really designer drug emporiums for white people, right? And so if I'm a white male and I want to do my designer drugs, perhaps I should think about how I'm doing something that a lot of black and brown people, and even some underprivileged white people have gone to jail for doing the same thing that I'm doing, and potentially support or think and take the responsibility to seek out black and brown owned dispensaries and shops or cultivators, manufacturers of the products that I'm trying to use. Is that somewhat of the advice that you would have?
Yeah, Rob, I'm really glad you brought this up. I think we need just generally need to be more mindful of the historical and political context for which we're operating in. And cannabis is has such a deep racialized and masculinized history. Some of you may not be aware, but although rates of marijuana use is documented by research equivalent amongst Black and whites. In the US, American men have been almost 4 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana
Mm.
than whites. And so
Right.
that's just like the tip of the iceberg to just really show
And
how
some of them are still in jail today.
that's right.
They're still
That's right. And
incarcerated today. Like, that's wild.
and the hit and the history of marijuana being used as a lever for racism dates back to the early 1900s, where the U.S. using it to sort of maintain its position as a white superpower against Mexican
Mm.
immigrants, Black men in the South. And so, there's a deep history there. I think for listeners that are marijuana users, particularly, like Rob,
Wait,
your
wait, wait.
White,
profile,
Just to
white
be clear,
cisgendered
th-
male.
this is a
white
it was a
cisgender men.
that was a hypothetical, by the way.
Of
Just so
Yeah,
we're
course,
yeah,
just so we're,
hypothetical. Of
yeah.
course,
hypothetical.
of
Yeah, yeah.
course. Should spend some time getting to know more about the history because it is really
Right.
important, which is why there's been so much activism around trying to create a diverse cannabis industry. Is that, from my opinion, there should just be a real ownership amongst Black and brown entrepreneurs to be able to grow and develop the space, just kind
Mhm.
of based on that deep racism that exists. And
I
I
agree.
appreciate that. Thanks for sharing that. You talked about some of the advantages that the new majority might be having. Maybe that could be translated into privilege. But what are some of the disadvantages for folks, and how do you kind of overcome that?
yeah, so cannabis, another thing that's made it a really interesting context to study, it's incredibly complicated. It's incredibly complex to obtain a recreational license. He-
Ah,
In most states, I'll sort of speak to here in Massachusetts. So, first you have to obtain an eligible real estate, which has to be within 500 feet of a school, for example. Then you have to obtain a
ah,
community host agreement, which happens at the local level. Then you have to go to the zoning board. I mean, and then you're able to get a license. So there are various layers to the process. And each of those layers brings their own set of written and unwritten rules around social capital, cultural business norms, who you know, how you present yourself. And, we talk about raising capital and we talk about social capital and some of the barriers that go along with those. But it's so much more complex about how each of our processes can have very heteronormative, masculinized, quite frankly, white norms that go along with them.
mhm,
And I think as practitioners, as members of the ecosystem, we really have to continue to question those norms and mix them up so that they actually are inviting to to the new majority, right? And so
mhm.
I think some of that has been happening here in Massachusetts and it's encouraging to see, but I think we have a long way to go.
So we're talking about the cannabis industry. You talk about those process, all those different things that need to happen in order for someone to even have a license, or all those advantages that are accrued, in the processes that have existed forever. And so, is that the responsibility at this? Is it at the state level? Is it, how do you change those barriers to entry? Because in business we want barriers to entry, right? So if we have a new industry and people start to jump in, the thing that they're looking for is how do I erect as many barriers for new entrants or non-traditional entrants into a market as possible in order to have an advantage, in order to keep making money. So how do we lower those barriers to entry in something like cannabis? What's been effective?
There have been some social equity policies that have been experimented with and piloted here in Massachusetts, such as expedited licensing. There's been some training programs that I think has been impactful. Obviously, the biggest barrier to entry is capital, which is nothing new
Yep.
to cannabis. But I would say
Mhm.
that, the because of the fact that cannabis is federally illegal, and because the licensure process can take so long, you have to obtain your space, you have to pay rent while you hold on to your space, you have to pay for the
Mm.
license process. Then, before you're even ready to get inventory, we need to get capital into the hands of the new majority, and we need to create alternative vehicles to do that. I know the state of Massachusetts is working on that as well. But a broader point that I think is really important to make is that all of us that participate, down to the consumer, that participate in entrepreneurial culture, that are participating in cannabis, we have to also play a role in questioning the norms, questioning the culture. It's like, I think about just the art of the PowerPoint, right? And when you go into any kind of investor setting and you have to design your 10-slide pitch deck, and the
Mhm.
training and socializing that goes into like an effective pitch, and what it means to have conversations with investors, and the way that you ask for money, and so much of that is like, it needs to be disrupted and
Mhm.
recreated and more inclusive to other cultures, other norms around communicating. It's so gendered, it can be so white, right? And so I'm just sort of using the PowerPoint as an example. It's like, can we just please disrupt the 10-slide pitch? Like, are there other ways that are going to be more inclusive to people of color, to women that are brilliant entrepreneurs and have, who I want to invest in, but that don't show up and sort of fit into these boxes of what effective quote unquote entrepreneurship looks like.
Yeah. I
Sorry, that was
appreciate that. I
soapboxy.
mean, so no, I love it, but what are the recommendations then? How do people disrupt that? Because, it's interesting. In season 1, we talked to many folks who work in different industries and have accelerator programs and have mentorship programs as for founders or for these kind of startup kind of entrepreneurs who are really starting to disrupt what it means to find funding as someone who may represent a diverse product or a product for a diverse group of people. And so I'm just so curious, like, how do you disrupt that when, and especially from like a regulatory stance, when some states don't even, it's not legalized in some states. And then how do you find support and networking and other folks that are in this world to then build that network and get capital and do all these things that are needed as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, so using the cannabis industry as an example, I think from a consumer level, obviously, like, just be mindful of, there are more and more shops that are popping up. If you're a cannabis user, be mindful of what the ownership looks like, what the practices are, where the product's coming from. I mean, I think that mindset applies across all industries and all products. I think sometimes we
Yeah.
actually don't recognize our power and the importance of consumer power. Obviously, from an investor perspective, there are all sorts of different ways to get involved with investing now. You don't have to be a formal angel investor. There's plenty of crowdfunding. There's plenty of programs to sort of engage with philanthropically. So, I think people need to be really cognizant of how they're diversifying. And I'm gonna bring it down to baseline. And I start off all of my organizational behavior classes really having my students delve into identity, and I feel
Mm.
like as DEI practitioners, as activists in the entrepreneurial community, we're all trying to do the work, but it actually also starts with being really mindful of our own identities and how they're impacting the work that we do. And I think this actually doesn't get talked about enough,
Mhm.
because your own positions of privilege, your own intersectionality, it really impacts the way that you're interacting, the way that you're seeing in the world. And so one of the things I wanted to, as a takeaway today, is really talk about intersectionality's power, I think, to be a tool of activism and a framework that can be brought into organizations. it highlights how our identities interact with each other and sort of the compounding nature of identity, but it also helps us think more about systems and processes and sort of the disciplinary, cultural, and structural ways that both entrepreneurial ecosystems function, but also organizations. And so that was something that I wanted to leave listeners with today.
Yeah, and I know
Love
you're
that.
passionate about intersectionality as a tool. So make that real for me and for our listeners. What does that look like in practice, and how can it be? Why are you so passionate about how that can be a very effective tool?
So, again, so starting sort of with your own accesses of privilege and or oppression, kind of making sure that you have that personal awareness and instilling that in others around you, I think, right? So understanding how at the identity level, how it's forming our interactions. And then if you delve deeper into sort of intersectionality as a framework, there's four buckets to think about and use as a tool of analysis. The first is the interpersonal, which was the identity level I just mentioned. The second is the cultural domain, so thinking about how ideology and cultural norms influence the way that we think about things, right? The way that we're
Mhm.
socialized is incredibly powerful. And cannabis particularly, so one of the things that my research surfaced about Massachusetts from a ideological perspective and cultural domain perspective is that there were quite a few women of color that were nominated into positions of power. And there was a lot of conversation in the field about how that was having a really positive impact on the industry, on policy. And so that kind of representation and the discourse around the importance of representation, I think, really matters, right? So we all know
Hmm.
that it's really powerful to put women of color in leadership positions for all sorts of
Absolutely.
different reasons, right? So those decisions are really, really influential. And then there's the disciplinary domain, which is how rules get made, who they impact, and why. And I think there's also the unwritten rules or the unspoken rules in organizations. We see that all the time in our work, our DEI work, right?
Hmm.
How are those rules written? Who are they impacting? So making sure you're spending time really thinking about that. So in the example of cannabis, one of the sort of regulatory rules is that your space can't be within 500 feet of a school. And there was a lot of confusion around that at the
Mm.
beginning within Boston. So some people had the means to hire like even a legal consultant to help them and,
Mm.
connect in with real estate to help them decipher where are the eligible spaces. Some people just had to try and do the due diligence on their own. And so sometimes the
Mhm.
opaqueness of rules creates barriers, right? And there's
Hmm. Hmm.
levels of privilege around that. So just using that as an example. And then
Mm.
obviously, like how structures and systems and processes are also impact you based on who you are and what your identity is. So just thinking about using cannabis as an example, thinking about finding an eligible real estate and then obtaining that and being able to pay the lease or the rent for,
Hmm.
12 to 14 months or whatever the wait time is, or being privileged enough to own a space that was eligible for a cannabis shop. The sort of race gap when it comes to real estate ownership in Massachusetts is incredibly vast and it's a huge
Mm.
problem, right? So just thinking about how that immediately becomes a structural barrier for cannabis entrepreneurs. So just using that again as an example. So there's different ways to apply the framework to really think about how processes and these different domains impact you based on who you are and how your identity shows up in the world.
Mm. Just kind of wrapping up here, unless Rob, did you have any other questions I wanted to ask about how our community, how our listeners can be of service to you in the work that you continue to do in your research and so on and so forth?
I mean, I encourage listeners to look into intersectionality. I think it doesn't purely live in academic worlds. There are a lot of organizations and practitioners out there that are definitely using intersectional thought. I mean, intersectionality was born out of Black activism and the Black feminist movement. But I'm really curious about how we can use it as practitioners and bring it into how we're developing and thinking about DEI strategy. So if you pursue that, let me know how it goes. Please contact me. It's something that I'm obviously is a very active part of my own research. And then for those of you that are part of the cannabis world in any way, either as an investor, as a consumer, as an entrepreneur, just please be mindful of how we can continue to diversify the industry, support Black and Brown entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs that I think are really building a new frontier and showcasing the way that entrepreneurship can just be done differently. Yeah.
I love that. Love that. That's great. And then are there any resources or things that you're watching or listening to or reading that you think would be helpful for our listeners?
Yeah, I thought I would leave you with two things. So, Kimberly Crenshaw is really recognized as she really brought intersectionality into kind of at the academic world, into the academy. She has a more recent TED talk about sort of the urgency behind intersectionality. It's very powerful, trigger warning. It sort of does talk about a lot of the tragedy that's happening to Black women specifically, but I think I encourage everyone to watch it. And then this book have found most useful. It's sort of a guide to intersectionality. It talks about it both from an academic and a practitioner lens.
And
Because
it
it's
is
just called
intersectionality.
Intersectionality. I recommend it
Yeah.
for those of you that are interested.
Well, that's great. HeatherJean, thank you. Dr. HeatherJean MacNeil, thank you for
Dr.
stopping by.
HeatherJean MacNeil.
It has been a pleasure having you join us on Inclusive Collective. We will be right back with our reflections.
Welcome back, Nadia. Really enjoyed the conversation with Dr. MacNeil. I sounded like a really big drug user there as I
Yeah.
was thinking about it, but I thought the use of the cannabis industry as a way to dive into some of the things that happen when a new industry emerges and how it can be taken over and how people can be crowded out in
Yeah.
terms of their roles. It was really interesting, and so I was really excited to have Dr.
Totally.
MacNeil
I
on.
knew we'd have fun with her and talk about cannabis, like you said, and intersectionality. I really appreciated Dr. MacNeil, just, kind of the discussion around the advantages and disadvantages and the privileges associated in this business. And then also just especially because it's a
Mm.
new and rising industry to to really engage on. In some ways it's kind of sexy. So I think it's kind of cool. Um, Dr. MacNeil did recommend reading the book Intersectionality as a resource. We'll be sure to put that in our show notes for folks who are looking for a resource. And we want to thank Dr. MacNeil for joining us today. We want to thank our listeners. Um, we are excited for what we have on deck for you for season 2. Inclusive Collective is a production of Rifelion Media. If you like this episode, please be sure to rate and review. We would love for you to subscribe if you haven't already. You can find us on Instagram and LinkedIn. And I think now TikTok, by the way. If you
Awesome.
right,
Yes.
if you'd like to
You
reach,
can't find me on TikTok.
can't find you,
No.
but you can find Inclusive Collective. If you'd like to reach out to us, please do so at inclusivecollective@rifelion.com. Rob, it's been swell. Be well. See you next week.